Okay, this evening we start on 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Thank you, Dan. Remember chapter 1, we're dealing with the changing of the people to be prepared, and so they could escape, of course, the wrath of God that is to come. And this evening we start looking at chapter 2. And this is dealing with the care of Paul in his preaching. And chapter 2 is emphasizing Paul's mission, Paul's manner of entering into Thessalonica, Paul's manner of presenting the gospel to these people, and the method by which he used in doing that. And he did all that because of his care for them. And chapter 2 is what we'll be emphasizing this evening. We look at this map. I'll keep this up here because I'll make reference to it a couple times, probably this evening. But remember that this congregation was established on Paul's second missionary journey. And if you'll note, here on the top of the screen, to be on the left-hand side, we talk about from Troas, he went to Philippi, and it was there where Paul ended up, of course you remember, ended up in prison. And they read about the conversion of the Philippian jailer. There in Acts chapter 16, that's in Acts chapter 16. And then we read about Lydia there in Acts chapter 16. He leaves there, and now he goes to Thessalonica. And you read the account there in Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, about what happened in Thessalonica. When Paul arrived there, went to the synagogue, preached to the Jews. Also some Gentiles Paul was able to teach, and certainly several of the women also were obedient to the gospel that Paul preached. Now, there came a time where some of the Jews that were not believers, that is, had not believed and had not accepted what Paul preached, they began to stir up some stuff there in Thessalonica, to the extent that Paul had to leave Thessalonica. And so Paul takes off. And he goes from Thessalonica down to that province known as Achaia. Remember, Macedonia and Achaia, the northern province, Macedonia, Achaia, the southern province of what is known as Greece. And so he goes to Achaia. And we see here on the map, of course, he first goes to Athens, and we read there in Acts chapter 17 what happened there at Athens. And then he travels to Corinth. Now, Paul decides to send Timothy back to Thessalonica. Paul had suffered some things there at Thessalonica, and also the brethren had also suffered, and they are being persecuted as well. And so Paul wanted to check up on them. And so he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. Timothy comes back to Corinth, and he reports to Paul how that the church is doing in Thessalonica. Now remember, this is at the most 6 months from the time he left Thessalonica. 6 months at the most. And probably, as I said, the most, probably not even that, but at the very most, 6 months. And so Paul's concerned about these brethren. So when Timothy comes back, he gives this report. Listen, they are doing great. And that's what some of the things that Paul writes concerning here in chapter 1. Remember how thankful he was and how, man, how he heard that these brethren and how they're doing. And he was so thankful how they were doing. Now, and Timothy reports this to Paul, that they do have some issues with the coming of Christ. And they were misunderstanding about some things in reference to the second coming of Christ. And Paul deals with this in chapter 4. And so Paul wrote this letter from Corinth. And so just a few months after, he has left Thessalonica. But overall, spiritually speaking, these brethren are doing well. And so in chapter 2, as he writes to them, for yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. When I came to you, and the time that I spent with you, it was not in vain. It was not empty. That's evident because the opportunity I had to preach, the opportunity I had to present the gospel, and by the very fact that you heard the things I preached and you received them, you accepted them, you obeyed. And so when I came to you and I labored among you, it was not, Paul says, in vain. But even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as you know. And notice that Paul mentioned in verse 1 and 2 that what he's writing to them, he knows that they know. And he's simply reminding them of these things. And so by the very fact that they knew of these things, they knew how Paul had suffered while he was and had been in Philippi. And so Paul said, I know that you know that, and how that I was treated while there. And so in spite of all that, I mean, Paul could have decided after his experience at Philippi to say, I think I'll head back. If I'm going to be treated like this, I think I'll just go back. I think I'll just end this journey right now. But Paul said, in spite of that, notice he says, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. Now, Paul said, I suffered, I was mistreated, and when I came to you, man, I spoke to you with boldness. What does that mean? To speak with boldness. To be bold in speaking. Abraham?
To be confident.
To speak with confidence, that's good. To speak with assurance. Now, I want you to know something here. And literally without fear. Okay? Without fear. And as Paul spoke, he did so without fear, in spite of knowing how he had suffered before, how he had been treated before, how he had been mistreated. So with confidence and assurance, he spoke to them concerning the gospel of God. Now, sometimes boldness or being bold can be misinterpreted. We're not talking about arrogance, okay? Sometimes a person can be bold in their stand for something that they may come across in the minds of some people as being arrogant. Now, it also does not mean that you are to not use any common sense at all and just put your life in jeopardy. And the reason I point that out, because what did Paul do when he was going through that suffering and even greatly being mistreated in Philippi, but now in Thessalonica? When you read about what happened in Thessalonica, go back and read Acts 17 about what happened. Paul did not stay there. In fact, the brethren sent him away. You may say, well, why didn't he stay there and stick it out? Sounded like he was a coward. Well, he wants to live another day, if you will. He knows other work can be done elsewhere. I mean, don't just take your stand knowing, okay, I'm going to be killed right now. I don't care. Well, wait a minute. Use some common sense. And so Paul, there were places that Paul went. You remember, his life was in jeopardy. And even sometimes when people stoned him, they thought he was dead. Well, Paul didn't stick around. Okay? If somebody's after you and says, I'm going to kill you next time I see you, I ain't moving. Okay, you can make that choice. I suggest to you, you better move. You remember there were occasions where our Lord talked about this. You know, you encounter some people, you teach, you encourage, you exhort. Encourage, I mean, and look, it's going in one ear and out the other. I remember one case we had in one place we were, where this couple, members of church, and they decided they wanted to go back to what they were before they obeyed the gospel. They liked the things of the world. And they liked the beer joints and that kind of stuff, and they want to go back to that. Not did they want to, they went back to that. Talk to them. You do understand what you're doing. You do know the consequences of what you're doing. And had different, and the elders and I both did, different times with them. And finally we came to the point that we told this couple, now, we have talked to you, we have studied with you, we have prayed about this. Now you know what you need to do. And you know if you don't change what we're going to do, we're going to have to withdraw fellowship from you. And they told us You do whatever you want to do. We're not changing. We're not coming back. And as far as I know, they never did. Well, we did. Another occasion had a man who became unfaithful, and he basically said, you do whatever you need to do. He was withdrawn from. He later came back. I remember another elder at another congregation. I knew the congregation well. And his daughter was at that time faithful in attending services. His son was up in his 20s. He married and so forth, had a kid or two. And his son decided, the church is not important to me. Now remember that his father was one of the elders. So what are we going to do? And his father said, well, I know what the Bible teaches. We have talked to him. Others have talked to him. We have no choice. We're going to withdraw fellowship from him. They did. Eventually, that faithful daughter became unfaithful. Now, she never did come back. But that young man that they withdrew from, he came back. He went to school, became a preacher. And preached probably for about 10, 15 years. And one day he was out mowing the yard, had a heart attack, died. Young man. He wasn't riding, he was pushing his lawnmower. I tell you, mowing your yard can get you. And but anyway, but the point is, I mean, sometimes listen. Here Paul is. Paul says, "Listen, man, I'm suffering, and people are out to get me. Okay, let's go. Let's go to the next place. We can do some good there. But Paul presented the gospel, he said, with boldness, with confidence, and with assurance. I notice verse 3, Paul says, now, please remember that he's prefacing this with these words, ye know. In other words, he's reminding these brethren how he came to them. He's reminding these brethren how he presented the gospel to them and what he said to them. And Paul says, now you know concerning when I exhorted you, talking about in verse 3, for our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. When I exhorted you and I taught you the truth, I was not deceiving you, and you know that. Contrary to what some modern, especially TV evangelists, may be doing. I exhorted you sincerely, genuinely, and as he later on points out, because I cared for you. Verse 4. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. The word pleasing here comes from a word which really means to be accepted. So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, listen, when I came to you, I taught you, I exhorted you, I wasn't trying to deceive you. I didn't do it with any kind of wrong motives. My intentions were good. And when I spoke to you the gospel, he said, I did so not because I wanted to be approved by a man, but I did so because I want to be approved and accepted by God. And certainly God knows, Paul says. I have been put to the test. God knows. In verse 5, for neither at any time, we'll look at verse 5 and 6 and close. For neither at any time used we flattering words. I was not hypocritical. I didn't try to use words to trick you into doing something. Paul said, I didn't do that. I didn't use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. And God is witness. I was not out to see what I could gain from you. Talking about that cloak of covetousness. I was not out to see if I could get some money from you. I didn't tell you words that you would want to hear, hoping that you would open up your pockets and give me some money. Basically what Paul is saying. A little bit contrary, again, to what we see today concerning the TV evangelist, if you want to call them that. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. Okay? Paul's basically saying, I was not after, I did not come to you to receive for you to glorify me. Okay? That was not. Of course, as you know, that was not my intent. That was not my purpose. Not only that, I want you to understand, and he's, again, I know you know this. I did not want to be a burden to you. I did not want to put a burden upon you. Paul says, I could have. I could have. That's the point here in the latter part of this verse where he says, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. As an apostle, Paul could have commanded these brethren, you support me. But Paul said, I did not want to put that burden upon you. Now, I could have. I could have. That's what it means, we're talking about here. Talking about as an apostle. You see, he had that authority. While Paul was in Thessalonica, and he's going to talk about, we'll close here, and Paul's going to mention this later on, how he labored night and day so that he would not be a burden to them. Not only that, while Paul was in Thessalonica, he received some support. You remember from whom? From the church at Philippi. They sent some support to Paul while he was in Thessalonica. Not just once, but twice. And that's found in Philippians chapter 4, around verse 15, 16. You see, Paul is reminding them all these things because Paul says, well, you know, man, when I came to you, here's why I came to you, to preach to you the gospel, and I presented it to you in a way that you could understand it, that you needed to understand it, that you need to hear, that you need to obey it. And my motive, my manner of doing all that, man, it was above board. I wasn't trying to deceive any of you. I wasn't trying to trick any of you, and you know that. I was not after any money from you at all. Because you know when I was there, I worked night and day to support myself. That's what Paul did. What Paul did. And Paul says, the reason I did that, because I cared for you. I cared for you. We'll pick this up next week. I guess in verse 8. Verse 8. Look over your questions. I basically, when I come up with these questions, I want you to look at the text. You know, we can talk about other things related to this. I want you to look at the text. I want you to learn what the text has to say. And very simple. You know, how does Paul describe himself when he came to Thessalonica? How did Paul present the word to those brethren there, to the people at Thessalonica? Look at the text. Now, we're doing this because remember, Paul says, be ye imitators of me as I also am of Christ. Let me suggest to you, we can learn from this. Oh, no, now, we're not apostles. But when we present the word to others, we need to make sure that our motive and the manner of doing it is sincere, it's genuine, and behind all that is we are presenting the simple gospel. Why? Because we care. So we can learn from this. We can learn this, how we approach people, how we present the word to people. And that's something that we can take from this here in chapter 2. Diane, you want to lead us in prayer, please? Yes, sir.